Black veteran humiliated by racist restaurant owner, not knowing who his son is. The warm southern sun beat down on Tom's Diner as John Carter, a distinguished black veteran and respected doctor, pushed open the familiar glass door. Neither man could have known that this ordinary Tuesday would change their lives forever. In a moment of blind prejudice, Tom Harris refused service to the very man who had once saved his father's life in Vietnam. But fate had a different plan, one that would unravel decades of secrets, connect two families through an impossible love, and force a town to confront its deepest wounds. "We don't serve your kind here," Tom's words hung in the air, sharp as a knife. As John Carter turned to leave, his weathered hands trembling slightly, he carried with him a secret that would shake the very foundations of both their lives. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. In the heart of Pine Grove, Mississippi, where magnolia trees line streets stained with history, Tom's Diner stood as a testament to time. The red brick building had weathered civil rights movements, economic downturns, and changing times, yet remained stubbornly unchanged, much like its owner, Tom Harris. Tom Harris was a man shaped by shadows. At 56, his face carried deep lines etched by years of holding on to bitter memories. He'd inherited the diner from his father, along with a legacy of prejudice that ran as deep as the town's roots. Every morning he'd unlock the diner's doors at exactly 5:30 a.m., just as his father had done before him, serving the same recipes to the same faces in a routine as predictable as the southern sunrise. Across town, in a modest but well-kept Victorian home, Dr. John Carter's day began differently. At 62, he carried himself with quiet dignity earned through decades of service, first as a combat medic in Vietnam, then as the town's most respected physician. The walls of his study were adorned with medical certificates and military honors, but the most precious photograph showed a beautiful black woman with kind eyes, Margaret, his late wife, who died 15 years ago when the town's white hospital had delayed her treatment. John's son, Michael Carter, had transformed that pain into purpose. At 40, he'd become the youngest African-American senator in the state's history, fighting for civil rights from his office in Washington. His father's quiet strength and his mother's tragic death had fueled his relentless pursuit of justice, though few in Pine Grove knew of his true influence. Sarah Harris, Tom's daughter, represented hope for change. At 26, she was completing her medical residency at the same hospital that had once turned away Margaret Carter. Beautiful, brilliant, and increasingly uncomfortable with her father's views, Sarah harbored a secret that would soon shake Pine Grove to its core: her growing love for David Carter, Michael's younger brother and John's second son. The town itself was a character in this unfolding drama. Pine Grove wore its history like a heavy cloak. Confederate monuments stood in the town square, while the black community's achievements remained largely uncelebrated. The railroad tracks still divided the town, more than geography marking the separation between white and black neighborhoods. Yet change was creeping in, subtle as kudzu vines climbing old walls. What most of Pine Grove didn't know was how deeply intertwined the Carter and Harris families truly were. 30 years ago, in the chaos of a Vietnam firefight, John Carter had crawled through enemy fire to save Thomas Harris, Sr., Tom's father. The elder Harris had carried that debt to his grave, never telling his son that he owed his life to a black man. And John Carter had kept that secret, along with others that could reshape the town's understanding of its own history. The diner sat at the crossroads of Pine Grove's past and future. For the white community, it was a cherished institution, serving the best apple pie in 3 counties. For the black community, it represented the lingering wounds of segregation and unspoken boundary that hadn't moved with the times. The lunch counter where Tom now served his regular customers was the same one where decades earlier civil rights protesters had been turned away. But Pine Grove was changing, whether Tom Harris liked it or not. New families were moving in, bringing different perspectives. Young people were returning from college with fresh ideas. The old barriers were beginning to crack, and all it would take was one moment, one confrontation to bring everything to the surface. None of them could have known that a simple Tuesday morning would be the spark that would ignite decades of hidden tensions, buried secrets, and unspoken truths. The stage was set for a story that would force Pine Grove to finally confront its past and choose its future. The morning sun cast long shadows through Tom's Diner's windows when John Carter stepped inside, the bell's familiar chime cutting through the breakfast crowd's murmur. He'd been coming here for coffee every Tuesday for years, a quiet ritual in defiance of unspoken boundaries. But today was different. As he settled onto his usual stool at the counter, the usual conversations died away, leaving an uncomfortable silence. Tom Harris emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. His eyes met John's, and something dark flickered across his face. The diner owner's knuckles whitened as he gripped the counter's edge. "We're not serving your kind today," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent diner. "Or any other day from now on." John remained seated, his weathered hands folded calmly on the counter. "Tom," he said softly, "your father would be disappointed to hear those words from you." The statement hung in the air like smoke, heavy with unspoken meaning. Tom's face flushed red. "Don't you dare mention my father," he spat. "You don't know anything about him," but John's eyes held a weight that made Tom's certainty waver. "I knew him better than you might think," John replied, reaching into his coat pocket. He withdrew an old, creased photograph and placed it on the counter. The image showed two young soldiers in Vietnam, one black, one white, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning despite the mud and exhaustion evident on their faces. "That's your father and me, 1968, the day I pulled him out of enemy fire." The diner had grown so quiet you could hear the coffee pot percolating. Tom stared at the photograph, his face a battlefield of emotions. "You're lying," he whispered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his doubt. Sarah Harris, who had been watching from behind the counter, stepped closer to examine the photograph. "Dad," she said, her voice barely audible, "that's definitely Grandpa." Her hand trembled as she reached for the picture, her medical student's ID badge catching the morning light. Tom snatched the photograph before she could touch it. "Get back to work," he snapped at his daughter. Then, turning to John, his voice shaking with rage, "Get out, now, before I call the police." John stood slowly, his dignity intact. "Your father never told you because he couldn't bear to admit that his life was saved by a black man. But he thanked me every year until the day he died, with a letter and a bottle of bourbon on the anniversary of that day." He reached into his pocket again, producing a worn envelope. "This was his last letter, sent just before he passed. I think it's time you read it." Tom's face had gone pale. Before he could respond, the diner's door chimed again. Michael Carter walked in, his senatorial presence filling the room. He'd been in town visiting his father and had watched the scene unfold through the window. "Is there a problem here?" Michael's voice carried the weight of his office, though few in the diner knew who he was. Tom's eyes darted between father and son, recognition slowly dawning. "No problem," Tom said quickly, his bravado faltering. "Just asking this man to leave my establishment." "This man," Michael said quietly, "is my father. And you've just violated several civil rights laws in front of a United States senator." The diner erupted in whispers. Sarah Harris dropped the coffee pot she was holding, the crash punctuating the moment like an exclamation point. As coffee spread across the floor, she looked at her father with a mix of shame and defiance. "Dad," she said, her voice stronger now, "there's something else you need to know." She glanced at Michael, then took a deep breath. "I'm in love with David Carter. We've been seeing each other for 6 months." The color drained from Tom's face as his world began to crumble around him. The letter from his father, his daughter's revelation, in the presence of a U.S. senator, it was too much. He gripped the counter for support, the photograph still clutched in his other hand. John Carter picked up his hat and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "When you're ready to talk about what's in that letter, Tom, you know where to find me. Your father was a good man who learned to see past color. It's not too late for you to do the same." The aftermath of the diner confrontation spread through Pine Grove like wildfire. By nightfall, the town was divided, with battle lines drawn between those supporting Tom Harris and those standing with the Carters. But fate had more cards to play in this unfolding drama. At the Harris household, Tom sat in his darkened study, his father's final letter trembling in his hands. He'd been staring at the unopened envelope for hours, the bourbon bottle beside him growing steadily emptier. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching her father with concern. "Dad," she said softly, "Mom needs you upstairs." The mention of his wife snapped Tom from his reverie. Linda Harris had been battling cancer for months, a secret they'd kept from most of the town. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. The only oncologist skilled enough to help her mother was John Carter. Meanwhile, across town, Michael Carter was making calls from his father's study. The civil rights violation at the diner could destroy Tom Harris, but John had asked his son to hold off. "There are things you don't know, son," John had said, his voice heavy with untold stories. The next morning brought another shock. Linda Harris's condition had worsened dramatically. Sarah, her medical training kicking in, knew they needed help. Specifically, they needed John Carter. She drove to his house without telling her father. John was in his garden when Sarah arrived. "Dr. Carter," she called out, her voice breaking. "It's Mom. Please. I know you have every reason to refuse, but she needs you." John wiped his hands on his jeans and stood up straight. "Your mother was always kind to me," he said quietly. "She used to slip extra pie to my Margaret when we'd stop by the diner back when your grandfather ran it." He grabbed his medical bag without hesitation. At the Harris house, Tom stood in the doorway, his face a mask of conflicting emotions as John Carter walked up his front steps. Pride warred with desperation as he watched the man he'd humiliated less than 24 hours ago enter his home to save his wife. Upstairs, Linda Harris lay pale against her pillows. Her eyes widened at the sight of John. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, "for what Tom did, for what we've all done." As John examined Linda, Tom hovered in the doorway, the unopened letter still in his pocket. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, John straightened up and turned to face them. "The cancer has spread," he said grimly, "but there's a new treatment protocol that might help. I've had success with it before." He paused, looking directly at Tom. "Your wife needs to start immediately, at my clinic." The implications hung heavy in the air. Tom's face contorted with internal struggle. His wife's life now depended on the very man he'd thrown out of his diner. Before Tom could respond, David Carter appeared in the doorway behind him. Sarah's face lit up for a moment before she caught herself. The young man's presence made the situation even more complex. "Dad," David said, addressing John, "there's something else you need to know." He took Sarah's hand, their fingers intertwining naturally, comfortably. "We're not just dating. Sarah's pregnant." The room fell silent. Linda Harris let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Tom staggered slightly, grabbing the doorframe for support. John Carter stood very still, his medical bag hanging loosely from his fingers. "How far along?" John asked quietly, his doctor's instincts taking over. 3 months, Sarah answered, her free hand moving protectively to her stomach. "We were going to tell everyone after Mom got better." Tom finally found his voice. "My daughter," he said hoarsely, "carrying a black man's child," but the words lacked their usual venom. They sounded hollow, defeated. Linda reached out from her bed, grasping Tom's hand. "Read the letter, Tom," she said weakly. "Read what your father wanted you to know." With trembling fingers, Tom finally broke the seal on the envelope he'd carried since the diner incident. As he read, his face went through a series of emotions: disbelief, anger, shock, and finally something that looked like understanding. "No," he whispered, looking up at John Carter with new eyes. "It can't be true." But the truth was there in black and white, in his father's handwriting. A truth that would change everything, not just for their families, but for the entire town of Pine Grove. The contents of Thomas Harris S.R.'s letter sent shockwaves through both families. The revelation was staggering during the war. After John Carter saved his life, Thomas S.R. had discovered that his own grandmother was a black woman who had passed as white. The Harris family's entire legacy of prejudice was built on a lie. Tom sat in his diner after hours, the letter spread out before him, its words burning into his consciousness. The truth about his heritage wasn't just shocking, it was reshaping everything he thought he knew about himself. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, some carrying signs protesting his treatment of John Carter, others supporting what they called his right to refuse service. The town was splitting apart at the seams. At the grocery store, longtime friends crossed to opposite sides of the street to avoid each other. The Sunday church services, once a symbol of community unity, had become battlegrounds of whispered accusations and pointed prayers. Meanwhile, Linda Harris's condition deteriorated rapidly. John Carter's clinic became her last hope, but some of Tom's oldest friends warned him against letting a black doctor treat his wife. "You can't trust them," they whispered, even as Linda grew weaker. Sarah and David's relationship became public knowledge, adding fuel to the fire. Anonymous threats began arriving at both families' homes. One morning, Tom found a crude racial slur painted across the diner's window. That same day, someone threw a brick through the window of John Carter's clinic. But beneath the surface tension, unexpected alliances were forming. Mary Beth Wilson, the mayor's wife, publicly announced she would no longer eat at Tom's diner until he apologized to John Carter. She revealed that John had secretly treated her daughter's addiction years ago, never asking for payment or recognition. The local newspaper editor, Jim Thacker, published an editorial exposing decades of unpaid medical care John had provided to both black and white families who couldn't afford treatment. The stories began pouring in countless acts of kindness that John had performed quietly, without regard for race or recognition. As Linda started her treatment at John's clinic, Tom found himself spending hours in the waiting room, watching black and white patients sitting together, sharing stories and support. He noticed how his daughter's medical knowledge complemented David's gentle bedside manner as they both helped out at the clinic. One afternoon, while Linda was receiving treatment, John Carter collapsed in his office. The secret he'd been keeping came out. He had advanced pancreatic cancer. He'd been treating others while fighting his own battle, telling no one except his son Michael. When Tom heard the news, something broke inside him. He remembered his father's words in the letter. "John Carter didn't just save my life in Vietnam. He saved my soul by showing me that character has no color. Don't make my mistakes, son. Don't wait until it's too late to learn this truth." The tension in Pine Grove reached a boiling point when a group of white supremacists from out of town announced plans to hold a rally in support of Tom's stand for traditional values. They didn't know about his newly discovered heritage or his wife's treatment. They saw only what they wanted to see, a symbol for their hatred. Sarah and David faced their own challenges. The hospital where Sarah was completing her residency suddenly found irregularities in her performance reviews. David's law practice lost several major clients. Yet they stood firm, their love growing stronger under pressure. Linda's treatment began showing promise, even as John's condition worsened. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man saving Linda's life was losing his own battle. During one treatment session, Linda grabbed John's hand and whispered, "You're saving more than just my life. You're saving our town's soul." Tom spent sleepless nights at the diner, poring over old photographs and documents tracing his family's hidden history. He discovered more letters, more evidence of the complex relationships that had always existed beneath Pine Grove's segregated surface. The weight of history, prejudice, and pride pressed down on all of them. But change was coming to Pine Grove, whether it was ready or not. The question was no longer if the old barriers would fall, but How many people would be hurt before they did? As autumn turned to winter, Pine Grove held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The upcoming white supremacist rally loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. John Carter's cancer progressed. Linda's treatment continued, and in the middle of it all, Sarah's pregnancy began to show a visible symbol of hope for a new generation, or a target for those resistant to change. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either tear Pine Grove apart or forge it into something new. The next few days would test everyone's courage, loyalty, and capacity for both hate and love. The day of the white supremacist rally dawned cold and gray. Tom Harris stood in front of his diner, watching as trucks with Confederate flags began rolling into town. His hands trembled as he unlocked the door, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision he'd made the night before. Inside, he began taking down the white's only sign that had hung in his window since his father's time. As he did, he heard the first shouts from the gathering crowd outside. Through the window, he could see the protesters facing off against counter-protesters, the tension thick in the morning air. Across town, at John Carter's clinic, Sarah and David were helping patients through the back door. Linda Harris was scheduled for treatment, but the growing crowd made it dangerous for anyone to be seen entering the clinic. John, despite his weakening condition, insisted on keeping the clinic open. "These people won't stop us from saving lives," he said, his voice weaker but his resolve stronger than ever. The situation exploded when Linda Harris arrived for her treatment. Someone in the crowd recognized her, and word quickly spread that Tom Harris's wife was being treated by the black doctor. The angry mob turned toward the clinic, their chants growing more menacing. Tom heard the commotion from his diner. Without thinking, he ran toward the clinic, pushing through the crowd. He arrived just as the first rock shattered a clinic window. Inside, he could see his wife being sheltered by Sarah and David, while John Carter calmly continued treating a young child. Something snapped inside Tom. He climbed onto a nearby bench, his voice ringing out over the crowd. "Stop," he shouted. "You don't know what you're fighting for." The crowd quieted, expecting him to support their cause. Instead, Tom pulled out his father's letter. "My father was a proud man," he began, his voice shaking. "He's too proud to admit that the man you're threatening today saved his life in Vietnam. Too proud to admit that our own family carries the blood you're so afraid of." He began reading the letter aloud, revealing his family's hidden African-American heritage. The crowd stirred uneasily. Some of the out-of-town agitators started to shout him down, but local faces in the crowd showed shock and recognition. As Tom read, John Carter emerged from the clinic, standing tall despite his illness. "I've treated many of your families," he said quietly, but his voice carried. "I've delivered your babies, cared for your elderly, kept your secrets. We're all connected, whether you want to admit it or not." The tension reached its peak when one of the protest leaders, a man from out of state, rushed toward John with a raised fist. Without hesitation, Tom stepped between them, taking the blow meant for John. The crowd gasped as Tom fell, blood streaming from his nose. Sarah ran to her father as David called the police. Local people in the crowd began stepping away from the out-of-town agitators, many of them crossing over to stand with Tom and John. As the police arrived to disperse the crowd, Tom turned to John, blood still running down his face. "I should have read this letter years ago," he said. "I should have seen what was right in front of me all along." John, swaying slightly from his illness, gripped Tom's shoulder. "It's never too late to stand up for what's right," he said, before collapsing into Tom's arms. The sight of Tom Harris carrying John Carter into the clinic, helping the man he'd once refused to serve, became a powerful symbol in Pine Grove. Local photographers captured the moment, and by nightfall, the image had gone viral, telling a story of redemption that resonated far beyond their small town. But even as the day's violence ended, its consequences were just beginning to unfold. John's collapse had revealed the severity of his condition to everyone. The clinic's windows were shattered, its future uncertain. And Tom Harris had publicly aligned himself with everything he'd once fought against. As the sun set on that tumultuous day, Pine Grove would never be the same. The old wounds had been ripped open, but perhaps now they could finally begin to heal properly. In the quiet chapel of Pine Grove Baptist Church, Tom Harris knelt alone, his hands clasped in prayer. The events of the rally had shaken him to his core, and for the first time in years he found himself seeking divine guidance. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows across his troubled face. The door creaked open, and Reverend James, who had known both families for decades, sat quietly beside him. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Tom," he said softly. "Sometimes our greatest trials are His way of opening our eyes." Across town, in the damaged clinic, John Carter's condition had taken a dramatic turn for the worse. The stress of the rally had accelerated his decline, and now he lay in one of his own hospital beds, with Sarah monitoring his vitals. Linda Harris, despite her own weakness from chemotherapy, refused to leave his side. "You saved my life," she whispered to John, holding his frail hand. "Now let us help save yours." But John knew better. As a doctor, he understood his prognosis. The cancer had spread too far, too fast. In a cruel twist of fate, his determination to help others had cost him precious time for his own treatment. David found Tom at the church later that morning. "Dr. Carter is asking for you," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. It's not good." Tom felt the weight of judgment from some parishioners as he left with David, but Reverend James's words rang in his ears, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." The same Bible verses he'd once used to justify his prejudice now condemned his past actions. At the clinic, the scene was heartbreaking. John Carter, the man who had saved countless lives, lay dying. Michael Carter had flown in from Washington, and the waiting room was filled with people from both sides of town, all united in their concern for the beloved doctor. Tom John called weakly as he entered the room. "There's something I need to tell you." He gestured for Tom to come closer. "Your father, before he died, he made me promise to watch over your family. That's why I never gave up on you, even when you pushed me away." Tom sank into the chair beside the bed, tears streaming down his face. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he whispered. John smiled weakly. "Forgiveness isn't about deserving, Tom. It's about love, the same love God shows us all." Outside the room, Sarah leaned against David, her hand resting on her growing belly. Their child would be born into a world still struggling with prejudice, but also one where barriers were finally beginning to fall. The news of John's condition spread through Pine Grove like wildfire. That evening, something extraordinary happened. People began gathering outside the clinic, hundreds of them, black and white, holding candles and joining in prayer. Among them were faces from both sides of the recent conflict, now united in their support for the man who had touched all their lives. Tom stood at the clinic window, watching the crowd below. The sight reminded him of another gathering just days ago, filled with hate and anger. The contrast was stark, and in that moment he finally understood what his father's letter had tried to tell him. Linda joined him at the window, leaning on him for support. "Look at them," she said softly. "This is what God's love looks like. Not division, not hatred, but unity." As the hymns from below filled the air, John Carter's breathing became more labored. His last words were a whisper, "Love one another, as He loved us." The monitor's steady beep turned into a continuous tone, and the great heart that had loved so many, despite so much opposition, finally stilled. Sarah buried her face in David's chest, while Michael gripped his father's hand one last time. Tom Harris stood at the foot of the bed, his world forever changed. In death, as in life, John Carter had taught them all about the true meaning of faith, love, and forgiveness. Outside, the crowd continued to sing Amazing Grace, their voices carrying up into the night sky, a testament to how one man's unwavering faith and love could transform a community. The old pine grove was dying too, making way for something new, something better, born from the ashes of prejudice and redeemed by grace. The day after John Carter's death, Pine Grove woke to an unexpected discovery. As Tom was clearing out his father's old office in the diner, preparing for renovations, he found a hidden compartment behind a loose brick in the wall. Inside was a stack of yellowed letters, photographs, and a leather-bound journal. The first letter he opened made his hands shake. It was from his mother, written just before her death 20 years ago, addressed to both him and John Carter. As he read, Tom's world tilted on its axis once again. "My dearest Tom and John." The letter began, "There are truths you both need to know. John, you didn't just save Thomas S.R. in Vietnam. Years before, when we were young, you saved me too. Tom, the night you were born, there was a complication. The white doctor was drunk, and John, still a medical student, defied the laws to come to the colored ward and deliver you. Your first breath in this world was drawn with the help of the man you've spent your life despising." Across town, Michael Carter was going through his father's study when he discovered a safety deposit box key. At the bank, the box revealed decades of canceled checks John Carter had been anonymously paying for Tom Harris's sister's medical care after a childhood accident left her disabled. He had also been secretly contributing to a college fund for Sarah. The discoveries kept coming. The journal revealed that Thomas Harris S.R. and John Carter had made a pact in Vietnam. Each would watch over the other's family if anything happened to them. John had kept his promise, even in the face of hatred and rejection. Sarah, examining the photographs, found one that stopped her heart. It showed her grandmother, Tom's mother, as a young nurse, standing beside a young John Carter in medical school. They had trained together, breaking barriers in their own way, until segregation laws forced them apart. The revelation spread through Pine Grove like ripples in a pond. The diner's regular customers learned that John Carter had been quietly paying for meals for elderly residents, both black and white, who couldn't afford to eat out. The hospital board discovered that he had been donating his salary back to provide care for uninsured patients. Linda Harris, still fighting her own battle with cancer, found strength in these discoveries. "He was always watching over us," she told Tom, "even when we pushed him away. That's what real Christianity looks like." The most stunning revelation came from Reverend James. He brought forward a letter John Carter had written to him years ago to be opened after his death. In it, John explained that he had discovered evidence that the Harris and Carter families had once been connected through marriage in the 1800s before Jim Crow laws took effect. They weren't just neighbors or friends, they were family. Tom stood in his diner, now empty of customers, looking at the old photographs spread across the counter. Each image told a story of connection, of lives intertwined despite the artificial barriers society had erected. The man he had seen as his enemy had been his family's guardian angel all along. David found him there, poring over the documents. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly. "Dad left instructions in his will. He's left the clinic to Sarah to continue his work. He believed in her skills as a doctor, regardless of the fact that she was your daughter." The weight of John Carter's generosity, his capacity for forgiveness, and his unwavering dedication to doing what was right regardless of the cost fell on Tom like a physical burden. He had spent his life clinging to prejudices that had blinded him to the truth about his own family, his own history, and the man who had been silently protecting them all along. As night fell over Pine Grove, Tom made a decision. He would honor John Carter's memory not just with words but with actions. The diner would become a different kind of place, one that would bring people together instead of keeping them apart. And the truth about their intertwined families would be displayed proudly on its walls, a testament to the fact that love and blood run deeper than prejudice. The next morning, as he unlocked the diner's door, Tom noticed something he'd never seen before. In the early light, the old glass cast a pattern on the floor, not a shadow, but a perfect cross. Sometimes, he realized, you have to lose everything you thought you believed in to find what you actually believe in. 2 weeks after John Carter's funeral, Tom Harris stood at a podium in the Pine Grove town square. The crowd before him included faces from both sides of town, all gathered for what he had announced would be an important declaration. His hands trembled as he adjusted the microphone. My entire life, he began, I thought I was protecting a legacy. But I was really just perpetuating a lie. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Today I'm here to tell the truth, all of it, and to make things right. Linda sat in the front row, stronger now thanks to the treatment John had started. Sarah and David stood beside her, their intertwined hands resting on Sarah's growing belly. Michael Carter watched from the side, his senatorial presence lending weight to the occasion. John Carter didn't just save my father in Vietnam, Tom continued, his voice growing stronger. He saved my mother's life when I was born. He saved my sister through years of secret financial support. He saved my wife through his medical care. And in the end, he saved my soul through his forgiveness. Tom reached beneath the podium and pulled out the stack of letters and photographs. One by one, he shared the evidence of the intertwined histories of the Harris and Carter families. The crowd murmured as he revealed the marriage certificate from the 1800s, proving their shared bloodline. "But I'm not here just to talk," Tom announced. "I'm here to act." He turned and gestured to the diner behind him. The old sign that had hung there for decades was covered with a cloth. At his signal, Sarah and David pulled the cord, revealing the new name Carter-Harris Family Diner. From today forward, this diner will be owned and operated jointly by both families. Every dollar of profit will go to a scholarship fund in John Carter's name, providing medical education for students of all races who want to serve our community. The crowd erupted in applause, but Tom wasn't finished. He motioned for Linda to join him at the podium. His wife stood steadily, color returning to her cheeks as she held up a document. "Thanks to John's treatment protocol, my cancer is in remission," she announced. "To honor his memory, we're converting the back room of the diner into a free clinic, staffed by Sarah once she completes her residency. No one will ever be turned away." Michael Carter stepped forward then, adding his own announcement. "The Senate has approved funding for the John Carter Memorial Medical Center to be built right here in Pine Grove. It will be the first fully integrated teaching hospital in the state." The crowd's reaction was immediate and powerful. Black and white residents embraced, some crying, others laughing. Old barriers seemed to crumble in real time as people who had never spoken to each other began sharing stories of how John Carter had touched their lives. Reverend James took the podium next, his voice ringing out over the square. "Let us pray together, not as separate congregations, but as one community, one family under God." The crowd bowed their heads as he led them in prayer. As the ceremony concluded, Tom noticed a group of young children playing near the diner's entrance, black and white kids running and laughing together, unaware of the historical significance of what they were witnessing. This was John Carter's real legacy. He realized a future where the color of one's skin mattered less than the content of their character. Later that evening, as the sun set over Pine Grove, Tom stood in the diner's doorway, watching all families share meals together at tables that had once been segregated. Sarah was showing Linda an ultrasound picture of their grandchild, while David and Michael discussed plans for the new medical center. A framed photograph of John Carter now hung prominently on the wall, his kind eyes seeming to watch over the scene with approval. Beside it, Tom had hung his father's letter, along with the newly discovered documents showing their shared history. Together, they told a story not just of past divisions, but of future healing. Pine Grove would never be the same, and that was exactly as it should be. The morning of Sarah and David's wedding dawned bright and clear, 6 months after John Carter's passing. The ceremony was to be held in the town square, between the newly renovated diner and the construction site of the future medical center. But as guests arrived, they found an unexpected scene. Tom Harris stood frozen at the entrance to the diner, holding a dusty metal box discovered during the renovation. Inside was a letter from John Carter, dated just weeks before his death, along with a deed and several photographs. The letter revealed one final, stunning truth: John Carter had known he was dying for over a year and had secretly purchased the land surrounding the diner, the very land where the medical center was being built. In my final days, the letter read, I wanted to ensure that both our families' legacies would be permanently joined. This land belonged to both our ancestors before segregation divided it. Now it returns to both families together. The deed named both Sarah and David as joint owners, with a stipulation that the land always be used for healing, whether of bodies, minds, or the community spirit. Accompanying photographs showed the land in the 1800s, when the Harris and Carter families had first worked it together. As Sarah walked down the aisle in her mother's restored wedding dress, the gathering wasn't just a wedding, it was a symbol of restoration. Black and white residents sat together, not by design or decree, but by choice and friendship. Linda Harris, now in full remission, beamed from the front row. The biggest surprise came during the ceremony. Michael Carter announced that the medical center would be renamed the Carter Harris Center for Healing, and revealed that anonymous donors, inspired by the story of Pine Grove's transformation, had tripled the original funding. Tom Harris stood to give his daughter away, but paused at the altar. From his pocket, he pulled out one final photograph found in John's box, a prediction of this very moment, sketched by John Carter during his final days. On the back, in shaking handwriting, were the words, "Love always finds a way. Trust in it." As Sarah and David exchanged vows, a warm breeze swept through the square, rustling the magnolia trees that had witnessed generations of division and now unity. Pine Grove's transformation wasn't just about two families anymore. It had become a beacon of hope for communities across the nation. 5 years after John Carter's passing, the Carter Harris Center for Healing stood as a testament to transformation. On its opening day, crowds gathered to witness the ribbon-cutting ceremony, but the real celebration was happening inside the renovated diner next door. Sarah Carter Harris, now chief of medicine at the center, sat at the counter where her father had once refused service to John Carter. Her young son, John Thomas Carter Harris, played nearby with children of all races, their laughter a melody of hope. The walls, once bare except for segregation signs, now told the story of two families united through love and forgiveness. Tom Harris, his hair now completely gray, served coffee with hands that no longer trembled with anger but moved with purpose and pride. Linda, fully recovered, helped in the kitchen, preparing John Carter's secret recipe for apple pie, a recipe he'd left specifically for her in his final letters. Michael Carter had just announced his campaign for governor, running on a platform of unity and healing inspired by Pine Grove's story. The diner had become his unofficial campaign headquarters, where people from all walks of life gathered to share their hopes for the future. The old photograph of John Carter and Thomas Harris, S.R., in Vietnam still hung prominently, but now it was surrounded by new images: Sarah and David's wedding, the birth of their son, the groundbreaking of the medical center, and countless moments of community celebration. As the sun set on that momentous day, Tom Harris stood in the doorway of his diner, watching the diverse crowd mingle at the medical center's opening reception. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see Reverend James, older but still wise. "You know," the Reverend said softly, "John Carter once told me his greatest hope wasn't just for integration, but for genuine love between people." Looking at this, he gestured to the scene before them. "I'd say his prayer was answered." Tom nodded, tears in his eyes. "The greatest legacy," he replied, "isn't in the buildings or the programs. It's in the hearts that have changed mine most of all." As if on cue, young John Thomas ran up to his grandfather, holding a freshly baked cookie. "Want to share, Grandpa?" he asked, breaking it in half with the innocent wisdom of a child. In that simple gesture, Tom saw a future where sharing wasn't a political statement but a natural expression of love. John Carter's vision had not just survived, it had blossomed into something more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. The old pine grove was gone, but what had replaced it was far richer than what had been lost. As evening fell, the lights of the diner and medical center glowed like beacons, guiding the way toward a future where love truly did conquer all. The price of love, a message from Pine Grove. In every heart that beats with hatred, there lies a wound waiting to be healed. John Carter's story teaches us that the greatest battles aren't fought with fists or words, but with persistent, unwavering love in the face of hatred. Like his cancer, which consumed him while he saved others. Sometimes our greatest gifts to the world come at the highest personal cost. Tom Harris learned that the walls we build to protect our prejudices often imprison the best parts of ourselves. His journey reminds us that it's never too late to change, never too late to love, never too late to heal. The hardest chains to break are the ones we place on our own hearts. The most profound tragedy isn't in dying, but in living without truly seeing the humanity in others. John Carter died knowing he had changed hearts, while Tom Harris had to live knowing he had wasted years blinded by hate. Which burden is heavier? To every parent who has chosen hate over love, every person who has turned away from someone different, remember your children are watching. They inherit not just your features, but your fears. Sarah and David's child was born into a world transformed by love, but how many children are born into worlds still darkened by their parents' prejudices? Love doesn't ask permission to cross the boundaries we create. It flows like water, finding ways through the smallest cracks in our armor. John Carter didn't just save lives, he showed us that true strength lies not in standing our ground, but in having the courage to step across the lines that divide us. The real miracle of Pine Grove wasn't in the grand gestures or public transformations. It was in the simple moment when Tom Harris finally read his father's letter and realized that the man he had hated was the same man who had been silently loving his family for generations. How many of us are hating the very angel sent to protect us? Perhaps the most heartbreaking truth is that it often takes death to teach us how to live. John Carter had to die for Pine Grove to learn how to love. His last breath gave life to a new community, but why must we wait for someone to leave us before we recognize their worth? In the end, we all face the same choice that Tom Harris faced: to hold on to our prejudices until they poison everything we love, or to let love break down our walls, even when it hurts. The scars of change are nothing compared to the wounds of remaining unchanged. Remember, every moment we choose hate over love, we're not just hurting others, we're dying inside ourselves. John Carter chose to love those who hated him until his last breath. Tom Harris chose to change before it was too late. What will you choose? Let your tears water the seeds of change in your own heart. For in the end, we all bleed the same color, cry the same tears, and long for the same acceptance. The only question is, will you be brave enough to love like John Carter, or will you wait until it's too late to discover that the person you hated was the one God sent to save you? If this story touched your heart, please show your support by subscribing, hitting the like button, and sharing it with those you love. Your comments fuel our passion to bring more powerful stories like this. Want to know what happens next in Pine Grove? Let us know in the comments below. Together we can spread messages of love and healing that our world needs right now.